So I wanted to explore this sort of, you already know this, and kind of like returning to innocence and going back to childhood and like figuring out what went wrong and what went oh so right and has always been going oh so right. And that really is what I want to talk about today. That you've already known this, that this is an alignment like with the mind, but that the light that was behind that was already knowing it fully. So if you think about studying the brain, if you're reading about the brain or you're a scientist who's actually studying like somebody else's live brain, then you're using your mind in order to understand what's already going perfectly, in order to understand it with itself. So this is sort of like a further removed example of being aware of being aware. And so it makes it easier to grasp. So the brain is already functioning like perfectly without us knowing how it works. However, if we know more about how the brain works, and we know more about how thoughts work, and we know more about how these processes work, then we can understand ourselves and we can sort of like help them out. And when it comes to solving diseases or solving problems or preventing problems, it can be incredibly helpful. So we don't need to know how digestion works in order for it to work. We come as babies and everything is working for us without us knowing anything about it, without even us knowing that there's really separation between us and our mother. And so it looks to us sometimes like things go horribly wrong, but in reality, that's ultimately never the case. So what happens is we often have these like amazing insights that come to us as kids, and this is a frequent occurrence, and we may tell somebody about it, or we may just be trained away at some point. And like when I told my mom that like God never clicked for me, what I was hearing about God never clicked for me until I looked out the church window and looked at the sun and just felt this amazing like connection that the sun, I'd figured it out. That's what God was. The sun was what God was. And she corrected me and gave me the Baptist thing. But my mother, I love her so much, said, it is interesting though, the sun and the Son of God. So all of us had like we had this knowing, and then we're trained away from it. And when I talk about the insights, those aren't the real knowing. Those are just an expression of the knowing. And so for us to understand what this guidance system is, and to go back and to realize exactly what's going on, sometimes we come up with this perspective that we're really mad at the adults who are supposed to know better, who are disconnected, who raised us. But if I can give you a key that will help you like with anything in life, it's that look for love where it is, not where it's missing. And so it's out of love, it's out of their understanding of love that they taught us that and told us that. But as you look back, you'll find certain examples that you have to sort of edit out. And remember that every memory we recall is always happening here and now. So it's always our awareness at the moment that's going to determine how like clearly we see that memory and process that memory. And so one of the implications of this is that trauma is always a deeply sort of mystical experience. And so when I was a kid, there was this point in my life where the Christianity and the sort of like repressions and I, on one hand, had these messages coming in that were like from my family to be like good and pure, and on the other hand, my sister watching MTV and seeing the messages on MTV and like trying to figure this out. And like one of the most traumatic things that happened to me is I had this like onset of intrusive thoughts, and one of them was to accept the devil, like accept the devil into my soul, or invite the devil in. And so I had this thought, and it felt like the worst thing I could possibly feel ever. And so what I thought and what I'd been told was that this was a very bad thing, and I was bad for having this thought. So feeling this entire time is telling me I'm feeling horrible. I've gone away from my guidance system, the love that I am. I've gone so far away from it. I'm trying to maintain this separation. And for whatever reason, I've had this like intuition that this separation isn't working anymore. And why it was so bold and direct, I don't know. But the law of attraction with our thoughts, if we really don't want to be thinking a thought, we'll think that thought. And so it's not until we can really love ourselves and love the whole situation, which that example, like God and the devil, was kind of going meta on, that we can see. So I thought that the thought was the cause of this horrible feeling, and me being a problem was having these intrusive thoughts and being crazy for having these intrusive thoughts or being a horrible person for it was the cause of it, when in reality the awful feeling behind that thought was I the self with a capital S do not feel the same way that you do about this thought. And so my rejecting that thought perpetuated the pain, and it wasn't until 20 years later that I was able to bring that back and see it for what it was. So another situation that happened when I was a kid, which I'm telling you these because they're ways that I've seen in my own life how this works, and it's for some reason it's extremely simple, but it's really difficult to describe to people and to do in the moment, because when you're that far away from your guidance and you want clarity the most, but it's not there, there's an opportunity for it to just pop. But anyway, so another example that I didn't feel bad about, but that was like profound into teaching me like this fear of death and this fear of losing other people and this fear of caring what people think all at once, is when I was 9 years old, my grandfather died, and my family members all lived like kind of close together. It's like a small town kind of thing. So we were like, my grandmother and my grandfather were our neighbors, and then my aunt lived on the other side of them. So he died, and it was like a day or two later, and it was a really hot day, and my parents had the sprinkler set up, and so I ran through it, and I started like screaming with glee. And my parents come out, and they're like, your grandfather just died, and you can't sound too happy. And I was like, oh. And then I can't remember exactly, I remember the situation clearly, but then I felt bad, like I'd done something wrong. I was happy, and I was supposed to be sad, and other people might be upset if they saw me being happy. Now, listening to a ton of Abraham Hicks and realizing the reality of death and how absolutely outrageous this all is to talk about, I realized that where my grandfather was, I was closest to him and closest to communicating with him or whatever else when I was running through that sprinkler, closer to experiencing what he was, closer to oneness. That was real grieving, and only kids can grieve. Well, that's not true, but that's what we're returning to. But usually only kids can grieve that way. So we're trained away from that. And so, like, blaming our parents isn't quite right, because if you raise kids, you realize that you have to teach them to consider other people, and you have to teach them, like, all these lessons. However, it's not the teacher that teaches us, and it's not the correcting words that are the problem. It's the way we take it, which comes back to listening to your own guidance. And if we really trust it, it can bring some profound understanding into our lives. Okay, so what separates us from this guidance system? What keeps us from listening to it? What keeps us from realizing how incredibly intuitive and complex and yet incredibly simple and always here right now it is for us? It's beliefs, and beliefs stem from the separation or feeling of separation, which feels awful. So the belief are thoughts that stem from a belief, and beliefs stem from different beliefs. So one of the things that we often do in spirituality is we demonize the belief in a separate self, and yet demonizing it and cutting it off from us, saying that non-duality is separate from duality, which is duality, doesn't work either. So we can't do that either. So one of the things that happens is we rebel against our guidance system. So we do not want to feel bad. We feel that we are bad if we feel bad. And so this is all sort of how that belief and that feeling of separation happens. So it's almost like a teenager who rebels against being corrected. So instead of feeling terrible when somebody comes up to them and they're running through the sprinkler, or like being reprimanded in school, instead of feeling terrible about that, they decide that they're going to push against that entire guidance system, that teacher, that parent, that whatever, and rebel against it. So this is a second separation. So this is what we do. We actually, again, that if intrusive thoughts come because they're thoughts, we think we are not allowed to think. And so because we think we are not allowed to think these thoughts, we actually think these thoughts. So anything you push against in thought, which is the only way you can push against, becomes an issue. And a belief is exactly like trying to secure yourself somehow. And this can be security as being liked and accepted by others, which is an honest, like, it's truly like the same. You can't tell the difference between like an actual threat and fear of death or being disliked for some people. So we rebel against it, and we say that if we feel bad, we are bad, which is the whole issue. And then we try to cut ourselves off from that guidance system. So after we go through that stage of rebellion, which is where most of us are, we realize, and usually by like your early 20s, sometime at that point, you realize how wise your parents actually are, and you actually invite their wisdom back in. So that's what we're doing. And at some point, maybe the guidance you receive changes and you don't need somebody to yell at you anymore because you've actually truly listened to their guidance. Maybe. So one of my all-time favorite quotes is that love is like the light of the sun. It falls equally on everyone. And yet, it doesn't. There's clouds, there's rain, there's the equator and the, well, it all evens out. But like, it does, but it seems, it does, but it seems sometimes to not. And this isn't resolved until you realize that you are the light.